$1. That's all it took for a lonely cowboy to stake his claim on a woman no man dared to touch. Her face was hidden beneath a rough sack, her silence heavier than the desert night. Folks in town whispered, mocked him for wasting coin on mystery. But when she finally spoke, her voice cracked like dry thunder. A single line that stripped the years of solitude from his heart and bound him to her forever. In that moment, the man who had ridden alone across 1,000 miles knew he'd found what no outlaw, no bullet, no storm could ever take away. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The auction yard was thick with heat and dust, the kind of desert air that made men restless, quick to gamble, quick to jeer. And yet even in that chaos, the hush fell sharp when the cowboy stepped forward, his boots crunching over the wooden boards like a slow drum roll announcing something the crowd didn't yet understand. He was a nameless man to most, a drifter whose past was carried only in the lines etched around his eyes. But today he carried in his hand a single dollar creased, sweat-stained, the kind of coin that might buy a drink or a hand of cards. But here, in this place, it was worth something different, something that made the crowd lean in with mocking grins and tilted hats as he slapped it down on the block, the sound echoing louder than the cattle bell that had rung earlier. The auctioneer smirked, trying to mask his surprise as two men led the woman forward, her wrists tied, her face buried beneath a burlap sack that carried its own legend heavier than any outlaw's bounty. And though she stumbled, she didn't resist, as if this humiliation was old and familiar, as if she had long since surrendered to the whispers that stalked her like coyotes circling weak prey. No man had dared claim her, no matter how much whiskey soaked their courage, for rumor in a place like this was stronger than truth, and the tale that clung to her was poison, that she was cursed, that her silence carried madness, that men who touched her met with ruin and death, and whether true or false it didn't matter, because fear travels faster than fact across a desert town. And so the crowd laughed when the cowboy's voice broke through, low and steady, claiming her with that single coin, that one act that felt both foolish and defiant, a man buying not a woman but a storm of mockery, and yet he stood firm, shoulders squared beneath the dying sun, his silence louder than their insults, his gaze fixed not on the crowd but on the figure shrouded before him, as though he saw past the sack and the shame and into some truth no one else dared search for. The hammer came down with a thud, sealing the bargain, and though the auctioneer muttered the official words, there was no cheer, no applause, only a ripple of unease twisting through the onlookers, because something in that moment had shifted, an old balance broken. A new fire lit, and as the cowboy stepped forward to take her by the arm, the crowd parted not out of respect but out of fear that whatever shadow clung to her might now stretch to him. And still he did not falter, guiding her away from the block, boots trailing dust in the long light of evening, while behind him laughter broke again, sharp, mocking, cruel, but already fading into the distance like the echoes of a dying storm, because the choice was made, the claim was staked, and the $1 gamble that seemed like madness to every eye in town was, to him, the first step into something greater, something unseen, something that would either break him beneath its weight or bind him forever to the woman whose silence had cost him a coin and would soon cost him far more. The saloon doors creaked on their hinges as he stepped inside. The cowboy whose dollar had bought more than any man in town dared claim, and the moment his boots hit the warped floorboards the air shifted, heads turned, whispers rolled like a rising tide before breaking into outright laughter that bounced from one smoke-choked corner to the next. Whiskey glasses clinked against dented tables, dice rattled across scarred wood, and every word aimed at him carried the sting of ridicule. Fool, lonely bastard, so desperate he'd pay coin for a sack. And though the insults burned hotter than the kerosene lamp swaying above, he gave no answer, no rebuttal, no bark of temper to give them the satisfaction, only walked to the bar with a slow, measured gait, each step echoing as if it were the steady beat of defiance itself. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a face like weathered leather, raised a brow but poured without question, sliding the glass across the counter until the cowboy's hand, rough and scarred from years of reins and rifles, caught it, lifted it, and drank slow, each swallow washing down not the whiskey's fire but the storm that gathered deep within. He heard them every sneer, every mocking chuckle, Every boast from men who fancied themselves braver because they dared laugh at what they feared too much to touch. But he let their voices tangle with the shuffle of cards, the thrum of boots on floorboards, the shrill whine of a fiddle straining in the corner, until it was all just noise, background to the silence he chose to keep. Yet inside, behind the mask of indifference, his thoughts circled tight, like vultures over carrion. Half of him gnawed by doubt had he been reckless, throwing away his coin and inviting ruin into his shack. Had the whispers of curses and madness carried a truth he could not yet see, and the other half burning with a resolve forged harder than steel, the same iron will that had carried him through miles of desert, storms of sand and bullets alike, whispering now that there was more to her silence, more to the shadow that cloaked her, something worth the scorn of drunken men who had never stood alone under a midnight sky with only the coyotes to answer. The laughter grew louder, sharper, a chorus of derision. But when a young ranch hand stumbled close and sneered into his ear, asking if the sack hid a witch or just a corpse, the cowboy did nothing, not a twitch of his jaw, not a flicker of anger, only lifted his glass again, drank, and set it down with the kind of finality that silenced the nearby table for reasons they couldn't name. For some things are louder than words, and the weight of his silence pressed heavier than any pistol drawn. The night stretched on, the crowd finding new targets for their cruelty. But even as their jeers dulled into drunken slurs, he sat unmoved, a storm coiling tighter behind his eyes, knowing the path he'd chosen could not be walked back, knowing too that though they mocked him as a fool tonight, the desert had a way of stripping false laughter bare, and in time the truth of his gamble would roar louder than their whiskey-soaked whispers. The shack was little more than a skeleton of wood and stone clinging to the edge of the desert, a single room weathered by wind and sand, where the roof groaned at night and the walls remembered every storm that had ever passed through. And into that place he led her, the woman with her face still hidden beneath the burlap sack, her steps slow and resigned as though she had walked this path in 100 nightmares before tonight. He guided her to the fire pit at the center of the room, where embers whispered in red and orange, coaxed to life with a few careful strikes until flame licked upward, casting shadows that stretched and bent across the walls, making her figure seem larger, more haunting, like the ghost of a story whispered too many times in the town that now scorned them both. She lowered herself onto the old stool beside the fire, hands resting in her lap, bound still with coarse rope, but he could see that what truly held her wasn't fiber or knot but something older and crueler. The invisible weight of years lived under judgment. Her silence pressed into her like a brand, and though she made no move to resist or flee, there was no surrender in her stillness either, only a quiet that carried more power than any words might have. The cowboy leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, hat low, studying her the way a man studies the horizon before a storm, wondering whether he had dragged misfortune into his home or stumbled upon something his life of dust and solitude had been leading him toward all along. And as the firelight flickered, he found himself searching her shadow on the wall more than the shape of her body before him. Because in that elongated silhouette, he thought he saw the truth, something chained. Yes, but not broken. Something waiting. Outside, the desert wind rattled the shutters like a warning, whispering that he had meddled in something men weren't meant to touch. But he ignored it, drawing off his gloves and setting them aside, the leather scarred like his hands, both marked by years of survival, and poured her a tin cup of water, setting it near though she did not reach for it, did not move except to let her breathing rise and fall, steady as the heartbeat of a canyon. He crouched low then, the fire warming his face, and though he did not speak, his eyes asked the questions his lips would not. Who are you? What weight do you carry? And what devil have I bought with $1? And in her silence he felt a strange kinship. For had he not too been shaped by years of wordlessness, by nights where the desert sky was the only witness to his loneliness? He almost reached for the rope, almost cut her free. But something in her stillness stopped him, not fear exactly, but a pull, as though unbinding her too soon might lose something neither of them could yet control. And so he rose again, pacing once, twice, before settling into his cot at the far wall, watching her across the fire, letting the night drag on while the shack filled with the hiss of burning wood and the unspoken question of whether he had brought home a curse, or the one salvation he never knew he was seeking. The third night settled heavy over the desert, the kind of darkness that seemed to smother even the stars, leaving only the restless cry of coyotes in the distance and the steady flicker of the fire inside the shack, where the cowboy sat hunched over, sharpening the edge of his knife with slow, deliberate strokes, each scrape against stone ringing louder in the silence than it should have. And across from him she sat as she always had since he brought her here, still, veiled in the sack he had not yet dared to remove. Her body held upright like a figure carved from stone, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing even and unbroken. The weight of her silence pressed at him harder tonight than the last two, every hour stretching longer, every glance at her shadow on the wall feeding the gnawing thought that he might have indeed invited ruin into his life for the price of $1. Yet he could not bring himself to regret it. Not fully, because beneath the fear he felt something else stirring, something nameless that had lain dormant in him for years. He set the knife aside, the stone clattering softly against the floor, and leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, fighting the haze of exhaustion that threatened to drag him under. And it was then, sudden as lightning cutting through a clear sky, that her voice rose into the room, raw and cracked, low but unshakable, carrying the weight of something too long caged. And she said, "You don't know what you've done." The words broke the silence like dry thunder rolling across the plains, startling him upright, heart slamming against his ribs with a force that felt foreign after so many years of quiet wandering. And he stared at her, searching for movement, for proof that he had not simply dreamt it, that the sack had not merely whispered on its own. And yet she remained still, the burlap shifting only with the rise of her breath, her voice hanging in the air long after the sound itself had died, filling the shack with a strange gravity that pulled at everything inside it, binding him to that moment as though the entire desert had tilted on its axis. He felt the words cut into him, not with sharpness but with weight, because they carried no threat yet promised consequence. A warning woven with sorrow, and though a dozen questions rose in his throat, what did she mean? What danger lurked now in the shadows? What fate had he tied himself to? None found their way past his lips, because for the first time in years he was not alone, and it was her voice, not her silence, that held him captive now. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on her as though willing her to speak again, but the room fell back into stillness, the fire popping, the coyotes wailing further out across the desert, and all he could do was sit there, pulse racing, knowing that the coin he had placed on the block had purchased far more than mockery and rumor. It had bought him a mystery alive with danger, one that pulled his lonely heart awake, and left him trembling with the certainty that nothing in his life would ever again be the same. The fire had burned low when she finally began to speak again, her voice ragged like wind scraping across canyon stone, coming not in a steady flow but in fractured pieces, shards of memory too sharp to handle whole. And though the burlap sack still covered her face, her words painted pictures clearer than any unveiled gaze could have done. She told him of a time not long past, when she was young and her laughter was not yet a crime, when her family's modest plot of land gave her pride, though it could never match the endless stretches owned by the man who would one day try to claim her. He was a rancher with too much land and too little mercy, a man who saw people as he saw cattle, things to be owned, worked, or broken. And when his eye fell on her, he made his intent plain, offering wealth and protection in exchange for her hand, speaking as though love could be measured in acres and head of stock. But she had looked at him and seen not a husband but a cage, not a promise but a sentence, and with the kind of quiet courage that makes enemies more dangerous than bullets, she refused, her no spoken firm enough to echo across the valley, a word the rancher was not accustomed to hearing, and one his pride could not swallow. "Vengeance," she said, "does not always come with guns or bloodshed. Sometimes it comes in whispers, soft as rattlesnake tails in tall grass." And so he branded her untouchable not with iron but with words, telling every ear that she was cursed, that madness lived behind her eyes, that men who drew close to her met ruin in their homes and death on their fields, and the town, eager to believe the rich man over the poor girl, took his lies as truth, letting fear rot away whatever kindness they might have once shown her. She spoke of neighbors crossing the street when she passed, of mothers pulling children inside when her shadow darkened their porches, of church pews that suddenly had no room for her though they had once welcomed her prayers, until silence became her only defense, until the sack over her face was not just a covering forced upon her but a shield she accepted, for it was easier to be faceless than to endure the stares that stripped her down to something less than human. The cowboy listened, his jaw tightening, every word she spoke digging into him like a spur. And though he had known cruelty in his own ways, loneliness, loss, betrayal on trails too long to name, this was different. This was a woman stripped not by violence alone but by the venom of a man's pride and the cowardice of a town too eager to serve power. And as she finished, her voice falling back into silence like embers collapsing into ash, he felt something within him shift, a weight that was not his but that he chose to carry nonetheless. Because in her story he heard not just ghosts of her past, but the warning of a battle yet to come, and he knew then that the dollar he had laid on that block had not bought him a woman at all, but a war that had been waiting in the dark, patient, hungry, and now suddenly, inescapably, his own. The cowboy sat long after her voice had gone quiet, the fire dying down to a faint red glow, the shack heavy with silence. But in his chest there was no stillness. Only a storm of anger and pity locked in a bitter struggle. Anger at the rancher whose pride had ruined her, whose whispers had turned a whole town into cowards, and pity for the woman who had carried that ruin like a yoke across her shoulders for years without breaking. And as he turned her words over and over in his mind, he came to a reckoning as sharp and sudden as a blade drawn in the dark. He had not simply bought her for $1. He had bought her fight, her enemies, her chains, and the long shadow of a man whose reach spread wide across the valley, a man whose money bought loyalty and whose cruelty bred silence. And in realizing that, the cowboy felt the familiar weight of solitude shift into something heavier but steadier. A purpose that dug into his bones like spurs into a horse's flank, sharpening him into steel. He thought of the years behind him, of riding alone across deserts and plains, of faces he had lost and graves he had left behind, of the countless nights where only the stars bore witness to his loneliness. And it struck him now with a force he had not expected that all that emptiness had been carving him hollow, preparing him for this moment, for this fight that was no longer about him alone but about a woman stripped of her name and dignity, and about the truth buried beneath lies that had festered in the valley too long. He rose from his chair and crossed to the door, pulling it open to the cold bite of night air, staring out across the endless desert where the rancher's land stretched like a kingdom built on fear. And he let the anger burn, not wild but controlled, the way a man tends a fire so it doesn't consume his shack but keeps him alive through the cold. And for the first time in years he felt a clarity, a reason to tighten the cinch on his saddle, to oil the chambers of his revolver, to set his jaw against whatever storm was coming, because storms were nothing new to him. He had weathered them all his life. But this one had meaning. This one had blood and truth at its core. When he returned inside, he glanced at her once more, still seated by the fire, her shadow long against the wall, and he realized she was no burden but a mirror. Reflecting back to him what he had long forgotten, he possessed the strength to stand against a world that would rather bow, the will to carve justice out of silence. And as the fire finally gave way to ash, he sat again, hat low over his eyes, not to sleep but to wait, because waiting was something he knew well, and he understood now that every mile he had ever ridden alone had been leading him to this reckoning, to this valley, to this woman whose curse was never madness but the courage to say no to a tyrant. And now that courage lived in him too, sharper than steel, heavier than any coin, and ready at last to be spent. Word traveled faster than the desert wind, carried on the lips of drunks and gossips who had nothing better to do than stoke the fire of a coming storm. And by the time the sun dragged its red body over the horizon, the rancher already knew, his pride stung deep, his fury drawn sharp as barbed wire, and before the day was gone he thundered into town astride a black stallion, 6 of his men riding close behind like wolves flanking their master, their spurs striking sparks off the stone as they dismounted, their shadows long and menacing across the dusty street. He was a broad man, shoulders like timber, his boots heavy enough that each step toward the saloon door carried a warning, and when he entered the room the air went cold despite the sweat and whiskey thickening it. Dice stilled in mid-roll, cards hung in trembling fingers, and laughter died in the throats that had once mocked the cowboy. For there are some men whose presence is too heavy to ignore, and he was one of them. His eyes, colder than iron pulled from a frozen river, swept the room until they locked on the cowboy sitting calm at the bar, a half-empty glass before him, his hat low but not hiding the quiet steadiness in his stare, and silence fell deeper than any church service as the rancher spoke, his voice like gravel ground under wagon wheels, telling him plain to give her up, to turn loose the sack-headed woman he had dragged from shame into his shack, or else be buried beneath the desert sand, forgotten and unmourned. Another nameless fool who thought himself braver than truth. The weight of the threat hung in the room, pressing down on every man who dared breathe. But the cowboy did not move, did not flinch, did not even look to the men bristling at the rancher's shoulders, his gaze never leaving the man who owned half the valley and yet still feared the defiance of $1. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, quiet enough that men leaned in to hear but steady enough to carry the force of a hammer striking stone, telling the rancher that some things, once claimed, could not be sold back, not for coin, not for mercy, not for life itself, and that whatever shadow the rancher thought to cast over him, it would not bend his back nor loosen his grip. A murmur rippled through the saloon then, fear and awe tangled in equal measure, for men had seen guns drawn and tempers flare, but rarely had they seen silence turned into a weapon sharper than steel. And in that charged moment the rancher's lip curled, not in humor but in a promise of blood, before he turned and strode out with the same thunder he had brought in, his men following close, leaving behind the echo of boots and the promise of war. And though the saloon dared not move until the door slammed shut, every man there knew the valley had just split in two, and the desert would soon decide which half survived. The night fell heavy and moonless, a shroud of black that smothered the desert in silence. But silence never lasts long when men carry hate in their holsters, and soon the stillness shattered with the crack of rifle fire in the distance, bullets whining into the dust outside the shack, each one closer than the last, a signal that the wolves had finally come. The cowboy rose from his chair in one fluid motion, revolver already in his hand, his body calm, though his blood burned hot, and beside him the woman, now unmasked, stood tall with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes fierce in the glow of the fire, no longer a faceless rumor but a figure of quiet defiance, and he felt her presence at his side like iron driving into his spine, steadying him as shadows moved outside the window. Men circling with laughter low and cruel, the kind of laughter men use when they think death is already decided. The first shot that splintered the doorframe brought no panic, only response, his revolver barking once, twice, the echoes tearing through the desert air, sending one of the rancher's dogs sprawling in the dust. And then the real storm began, gunfire flashing in the darkness, sparks striking off the shack's stone base, bullets chewing into wood as the walls shuddered beneath the onslaught. But still the cowboy held steady, firing with precision, each pull of the trigger measured, controlled, while the woman, far from cowering, took up the shotgun he had leaned by the hearth and cocked it with a strength that startled even him. The blast that followed tearing through the night and scattering the circling men, their howls no longer laughter but curses shouted as they scrambled for cover. Smoke filled the room, firelight flickering across her face, and in that moment he saw not a cursed figure or a burden, but the raw truth the rancher had feared, a woman whose silence had been forced, not chosen, a woman who carried in her chest not madness but a will unbroken, a strength quieter than steel but sharper than any blade. And together they stood shoulder to shoulder, their shadows cast against the walls like twin sentinels defying the world outside. The fight raged on, the shack groaning beneath the assault, windows blown out, the night alive with flashes of orange and white, and yet neither yielded. Every shot they fired not just for survival but for the dignity that had been stolen from her, for the truth buried under years of whispers, for the freedom that could not be bought or mocked into silence. The men outside, once bold, now faltered, fear sliding into their voices as the minutes dragged on, and when the fire in their guns began to wane, when their courage cracked like brittle glass under the weight of defiance, the desert grew still again, the last of them retreating into the dark with their dead left behind, leaving only the coyotes' howl to mark the end of the storm. And as the cowboy reloaded in the faint glow of dying embers, he looked at her face lit by fire, jaw set firm, eyes unwavering, and he knew without speaking that whatever curse the town believed she carried had turned to something else in the desert's crucible, something not even bullets could kill, and together they had just begun to claim it. Dawn bled slow across the desert, the sky painted in strokes of pale gold and bruised violet. A stillness hanging so heavy it seemed even the wind dared not move. And in that silence the cowboy stood at the edge of the town's main street, his shirt torn and darkened by blood from the night before, his body worn but unbroken, revolver resting loose but certain in his hand. Across from him, framed by the rising sun, the rancher emerged with boots pounding hard into the dust, each step echoing the weight of land, money, and power he carried like armor, his eyes glinting with cold fury. And behind him the townsfolk gathered in silence, peering from porches, from the cracked saloon windows, from behind wagon wheels, every soul drawn to witness the end of something that had stretched its shadow too long across their valley. The woman stood just beyond the shack's path, her face bare, her sack discarded forever, watching with the quiet strength of someone who had endured every cruelty and still refused to bend. And though her lips did not move, her presence spoke louder than any plea could have, steadying him, reminding him why he stood now despite the wound burning like fire in his side. No words passed between the two men as they faced each other across the expanse of dust, for hatred had no need of speech, and neither did love. And the silence that stretched between them was the kind that only the desert could hold, vast, eternal, inevitable. The rancher's hand twitched near his holster, his jaw tightening, his arrogance clinging to him like a second skin, even as the certainty of the moment pressed in, while the cowboy's gaze never wavered, his eyes calm with the steel of a man who had nothing left to lose but one truth worth dying for. And for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop. Every bird frozen in the sky, every breath held, the valley itself waiting to see which way fate would bend. Then came the crack, one single gunshot, louder than thunder, sharper than any storm, tearing through the morning stillness and sending a tremor across the watching crowd. And when the smoke drifted clear and the dust settled in lazy swirls, it was the rancher who lay sprawled in the dirt, his iron eyes glazed wide, his hand inches from the gun he'd never fired, his power bleeding into the sand as easily as water into stone, leaving nothing but a corpse and a silence now broken, not by fear but by the slow exhale of a town unshackled. The cowboy staggered once, the pain in his side fierce, but his shoulders remained straight, his revolver still in his grip, and as he turned his eyes found the woman's, their unspoken bond sealing itself in the light of that new dawn. For it was not victory alone that had been won but something deeper, a proof that love, quiet and steadfast, could carve its place even in the harshest of lands, and in the shadow of the fallen rancher the desert itself seemed to bow, its silence no longer a weight but a witness to the final stand of a man who had staked his soul on $1 and found it worth more than all the land and lies a tyrant could ever own. The street lay hushed in the aftershock of the gunfire, the dust still curling lazily around the rancher's fallen body, his blood seeping into the thirsty earth, and out from their hiding places the townsfolk began to gather, their boots hesitant on the dirt as though they were stepping into a new world they did not yet recognize. Eyes that had once turned away in disgust or fear, now fixed on the woman standing tall in the morning light, her burlap sack gone forever, her face unhidden, the firelight of battle still glowing faintly in her eyes. And though her cheeks bore the scars of years of silence, there was a dignity in her stance that no lie, no rumor, no tyrant could ever erase. Whispers rose at first, faltering and uncertain, the same voices that once cursed her name now too ashamed to speak her story aloud. But when she lifted her chin, her voice broke across the gathering like a clear bell, steady and sure, each word falling heavy into their ears. I was never untouchable. And in that single sentence the town felt the weight of its guilt, the truth of how they had turned coward in the face of one man's pride, how they had let her be buried in shame to keep themselves safe, and shame burned redder than the rising sun across their faces as the silence deepened again. The cowboy, bloodied but unbowed, holstered his revolver and stepped toward her, each stride slow but unshaken, his eyes on no one else, his hand reaching out not as a savior or master, but as a man who had found in her the piece of himself he thought the desert had stolen. And when her fingers closed around his, the strength in her grip carried more than gratitude, it carried the promise of something forged in fire, A bond that was not about rescue or debt, but about survival shared, about scars carried together. He felt, in that touch, the weight of solitude he had borne for years lift from his shoulders. The endless miles of silence and loss suddenly softened by the knowledge that he no longer walked alone. And in that moment the town, for all its shame and regret, could only watch as the two of them turned from the body in the dirt and began to walk forward, their steps measured, their heads unbowed, their figures framed by the rising sun spilling gold across the valley. Behind them, the whispers died altogether, not out of fear this time, but because the sight of them together had left no room for words, only the heavy stillness of truth settling at last into the bones of the town. And so they walked, two souls scarred by rumor and loneliness, yet bound by something stronger than curses, stronger than bullets, stronger even than death itself, a quiet strength, a love born not in softness but in defiance, carrying them into the light of a new dawn that promised no easy road, but one they would travel side by side, unbroken, unyielding, and finally, at last, free.